Hey, and we're live. Consent show part 2. Yes, 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 yes. I also just wanted to let you know that I am celebrating today. That's why I have a crown and some tinsel behind me. Today is is that backwards?
Yes.
That's backwards.
Today is the third podcast anniversary of Horizontal. Yay! So I was hoping in a moment you might help me by singing Happy Birthday to Horizontal.
Okay, here we go.
Ready?
Yep. 1, 2, 3. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday
to you. And many more.
With jazz hands.
Thank you so much for indulging me. I very much appreciate it.
Always.
I made a decision.
You did not have my consent for that, but okay.
Oh,
Dude, she totally had your consent. Yes.
But she just sort of rolled on. So.
I made a decision around 3 years ago that I was going to celebrate all of my successes, no matter how big or small I deemed them to be, because I realized that I couldn't actually feel success in my body. I didn't actually have a lived experience of celebration and success in my body. So I've been rewiring my nervous system for celebration and joy by celebrating all the things all the time. Welcome to the part 2 of the consent show. Yes, yes, yes. My name is Lila. Yes, I'm an investigator of human relationships. I'm the host of the Horizontal with Lila podcast, which when the podcast is recorded entirely while lying down wearing robes. Episode 107 is coming soon now that my computer is fixed and out of the shop. HorizontalWithLila.com is the place to find out all the things and to sign up for the weekly missives with my intimate wonderings, saucy photos, and events. Let me introduce you to Pamela Clare Wylie Samuelson. Pamela is a badass sex educator and creator of sex ed for grown-ass people. She's a bodily empowerment activist. In fact, she taught me how to use a speculum. She is a mother and a sexological bodyworker. She's basically Rosie the Riveter with a speculum in her hand. She is also my horizontal guest of episodes 50, Your Pussy is Not a Sheath, and 51, Take Back the Speculum. Pamela, willkommen. And is there anything else you would like people to know about you in this moment?
No, that's marvelous. Thank you.
Great. Willkommen. And then I would like to introduce you to M'kali-Hashiki, who is a renegade sexual mystic, also a sexological bodyworker, a Tantric Sacred Intimate, and creator of Fierce Passions, a Somatic Cyber Temple. M'kali-Hashiki, is there anything else you would like us to know about you in this moment?
I just was inspired by Pamela's introduction. I also teach medical students how to do pelvic and breast exams using my own body as the model.
Yeah.
I've been doing that for about 12 years.
You're a GTA.
Yeah, I'm a GTA.
Dude,
I'm
where
a
are you?
GTA.
Where are you in the world?
In Oakland.
Word. I love
In
this.
Oakland, California.
I love this.
Yeah.
So much. That's great. Thank
Yeah.
you for doing that excellent, necessary work.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And welcome, M'kali-Hashiki. I am delighted you are here. Thank you to Matthew Stillman
Yeah.
for providing a bridge between us.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Matthew.
You are so welcome.
And now allow me to introduce Matt Stillman, Tantric Bodyworker, author of Genesis Deflowered, a professional problem re-manager, a guide to creative approaches, of which he has given me oh so many over the years. I have been a grateful recipient of his transformative brain time and time again. Thank you. He's also a beloved horizontal guest of episodes 30, My Heart is Broken, May It Never Heal, and 31, The Skull Story, which is one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard in my entire life. Matt, is there anything else you would like people to know about you?
I feel very lucky to be included in this conversation because I was very happy to set aside to let you three voices have most airtime. So the fact that I was re-included, I feel very fortunate.
I feel grateful to have the benefit of your brain and your care. Thank you for being here. Let me briefly intro you to this platform, Get Vocal. It's designed for podcasters to be seen as well as heard, which is what I said earlier. You can comment and ask questions in the chat at any time, which is running on the left side. I hope you will. It's most fun when it's interactive. It's most fun when you chat and you play with us. The show is an hour, but I'll stay on for a bit after I end the broadcast to have secret hang time with those of you who are here live, in case there are things you don't want to say on the broadcast that you want to bring up. So secret time is a benefit to showing up live. They've added a tipping feature. It looks like a diamond. I certainly don't turn down tip, so I'm obliged to let you know. And if you have technical difficulties, as I sometimes have here in Bali, my bandwidth sometimes dips, which kind of kicks me out of the room or freezes me, then these lovely humans will continue. They will go on. They have my run of show, and I will return. And what I will do, which I suggest you do if you're having technical issues, is reload your browser. Thus ends the housekeeping. My question for us today is, when was the last time you had trouble saying no to something? I'll go first. I'm having trouble saying no to something right now. It doesn't feel right to me. This request that was made of me, it's just something in me says no, but there's all logical reasons to say yes, and I feel indebted to the person. So I'm having trouble and I have not responded, and that is not a way that I am proud of showing up in the world, but it is a way that I often respond when I don't want to say no. Who's next?
I've got mine.
Yeah.
It's a hot one.
Yes, please.
It's a hot one for me. Not a sexually hot one, but like an emotionally full one. Which is that I have been having since the beginning of quarantine, Sunday evening Zoom dinners with my family. With my dad's family specifically. My dad, my stepmother, my stepbrother and his family, and my two younger half-siblings. And there is a dynamic that has gone on since my childhood in my family where my stepmother and my stepbrother specifically get really fucking mean. And I find it really easy to not tolerate that when it's about my siblings, and I find it difficult to not tolerate that when it's aimed at me. And this past Sunday, it was aimed at me, and I hung up on the call without saying anything. Which I guess was one way of saying no, but I am feeling like myself my resistance to calling them out in the middle of a family dinner, which actually is what I would prefer. So that was the last time I had a hard one.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have one. I've been recently asked, and I don't know if any people are be kind of vague. I was recently asked to do a thing at another thing, and I really don't want to. And the particular thing I was asked to do feels really necessary. But it's not clear to me that now is the best time to do that, or that the specific thing that they're asking for sort of fits in my wheelhouse. But I really don't. I want to say no, and I feel like a little hesitant to say no. So it's happening pretty soon. So if I'm going to say no, I have to say no like today or tomorrow. I'm having some real difficulty saying no.
Right.
Thanks.
Yeah. I also just, I'm touched by what you just said, M'kali, because you didn't have to say what the things were to have you to feel the weight of it. You're like, so I just felt that. Family dynamics, Pamela. Good times. Old stories. My thing was just happened today, and this person is somewhere between a friend and an acquaintance. He's also he's a retired, a young retired hedge fund manager. He's got hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, he's spectacularly wealthy. Sort of asked me today to do like a money thing with him, and I'm like, but I was so sort of shocked by it that I was in my head, I was like, you don't need my money at all. You don't need, like, what are you? But I was so taken aback by it that I sort of like did like this sideways, like awkward, like, I'll get back to you. I'll think about it. But I really wanted to be like, are you? No, but I just couldn't. I'll have to get back to him the next couple of days, just out of courtesy.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask this question today specifically to show, and if anybody's here and wants to answer it in the chat, I really welcome that. I want to show that we all struggle with consent and boundaries in different ways and at different times. Nobody's doing this perfectly. And something I brought up in the first show, and I want to bring it up again, is that if someone were looking for evidence of us behaving badly in terms of consent, or behaving in a gray area in terms of consent in our lives, they could probably find it. They could definitely find it in mine. And that means that we're all in practice with this. It's an evolving organism that we're relating to. I think that's important. I wanted to bring up a few premises and read you a little bit of some writing by Eric Wyckoff Rogers, who's a scholar of sexual relationships, historical sexual relationships. So premises, I think Planned Parenthood's definition of consent is the most distilled I've ever found. And it's actively agreeing to be sexual with someone. So that's an idea of where I'm beginning with my conversation about consent. The matter of consent is complicated greatly by power, and we're going to talk deeply about that today. We got into it at the end of last show, and it's so vast and it's so deep and it's so complicated that it's probably going to be the focus of most of this show. And we can do our best to do it perfectly and still fuck it up royally. So when we fuck it up, doing it right means acknowledging the impact that it had, regardless of our intent. Apologizing, doing our best to make amends, and amends often are about changing our behavior going forward. And then I want to get into the flaws and the critique of consent culture by my friend Eric, and then let's rumble with that a little bit. So one of the things that they said, one of the things that they said was, in a blog post called Consent and Beyond, which I'll put in the chat, various commentators have questioned the validity and/or efficacy of consent as a holistic ethical framework concerning sex. Some radical feminists have claimed that true consent is impossible under structural conditions of power imbalance, and these are highly pervasive in our society. While others have observed that consent fails to call into question the way that power relations frequently inform the very things we want and choose, and that consent fails to address how our very choices may be deeply racist, classist, sexist, ableist, and otherwise exclusionary. Recently, Amia Srinivasan, a philosophy professor at Oxford, has observed how consent culture has tended to justify and reinforce what people already want, even when those things are racist, classist, sexist, homophobic, ableist, etc. There's a long, troubling history of how powerful governments, elite social classes, and other top-down institutions set about to shape sexual preferences in the 19th and 20th centuries. And practices were pretty much a ubiquitous aspect of the development of industrial colonial power. What you had were all kinds of stratifications based upon race, class, gender, of course, and sex. Both measurements of people's self-control and constructions of people's sexual desirability was used as a mechanism for making and maintaining these distinctions. For example, Black men were stereotyped as being sexually unrestrained and were persecuted based on the anxiety that they posed a threat to white women's purity. Women have been policed in their sexual behaviors and pressured to behave as if they lacked sexual desires, and deviation from these behaviors have been pathologized as unfeminine. Anti-miscegenation laws made it a crime for people to engage in mixed-race sex and partnership, and decades of stigma have brought sexual policing to the level of peer pressure and self-enforcement. And these regulations, pressures, roles, and stereotypes went on to inform our sexual desires and sensibilities. It's no coincidence that much of the stuff that people feel comfortable or enthusiastic about corresponds with policed social roles, categories, and hierarchies. We have a gendered, racialized, and classed political economy of sex, where certain people are thought to be the pinnacle of beauty and desirability, while many others are lower down in the sexual hierarchy. We also have highly gendered expectations about who does the asking and who does the permission granting. And this also highly limits our ability to venture out from socially scripted roles and scenarios. So the problem with consent is really part of a bigger problem in a culturally manipulated democracy, where, in the words of Noam Chomsky, consent is manufactured by the powerful. Too often, free choice is not a reflection of radical autonomy, but of top-down structures that produce our subjective preferences and means of evaluating choices and experiences. Eric Wyckoff Rogers. So as I'm marinating with that, I come back to this question of how do we know if what we want is what we really want or has been programmed into us? Thoughts?
You don't. It's not. And yet you can. It's not your job to find that out all by yourself. A well-earned village-mindedness will have other people reflecting to you that you trust and they trust you to have these lights shone upon your habits and your constructs. And hopefully those people have enough points of reference that things can be shaken and that you can trust them enough to have them take you on something that might be outside of your understanding, but is for you. But you have to start from where you are, which is, here's what I know I like, and who do I trust enough to take me outside of that?
I think about
what?
Please.
I think that in that what you just read, I feel like there's a like a conflation between consent and desire, when I think they're related, but they're not the same thing. And so I feel like much of what we desire is in some ways societally programmed. Our consent, so to me, there's like desire, and then there's the ability to engage in what you desire when it is presented as an option. And that's kind of how I'm looking at consent. Isn't the desire. The consent is the ability to engage in or agree to engage in the things you desire. So I do think it's true that much of what we desire is societally programmed. And that's why you see, you know, what's considered conventionally attractive changes depending on the time, the country, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't, but since that's a truism anywhere, to me, it's not a question of, you know, I have to try to change what I desire. It's more like, can I, you know, when we were talking, I said this once, it's not about necessarily having an answer. It's about the ability to ask the question. And if we're in a community where questioning what we desire is, you know, seen as divisive or argumentative, then we'll never get to a place where we might break free of that societal programming. So I think it makes sense to ask, okay, so I think thin women with big breasts are attractive. How much of that is really what I desire, and how much of that is what society tells me I desire, and how much of that is me trying to be normal because I've been told that to be normal means this must be what I find attractive. And if I can never ask that question, or if somebody asks me to question it and then I get offended, then we're never gonna really get anywhere with investigating that. But then the consent part is a little bit different. And I do think that the question of how much autonomy does someone have over their physical body, in addition to like how they, you know, can move in the world, what kind of leisure time they have. Does poverty keep them from having leisure time? So I think all of that stuff is what goes into the consent. Both of them reflect, you know, power things, but I don't think consent and desire are the same, was my point.
Absolutely. I don't think that's what he's saying. One thing I wanted to pull out from what they're saying. I don't think that's what they're saying. Working on my pronouns. And one thing I wanted to pull out was, okay, so let's say that somebody asks us about the makeup of our desires or the origin of our desires, to examine that, or we decide we want to examine that, and we find that we are programmed. I'm not sure how we are going to discern what percentage is actual desire, what percentage is societal, what percentage is what we think we should want. Yes, please.
So with regards to this whole thing about programming, I think it's important to say, I was sitting here taking notes as you were talking, M'kali-Hashiki, because I was like, yeah. I think in the desire to be normal or to be apart is the desire to be safe, because humans are social animals and social exclusion is a serious survival threat. So just to give that its proper due, like allowing ourselves to be programmed and to fit within a certain set of norms is part of how we are wired as animals, as social animals. And that has to be acknowledged in any discussion of like desire and whether we've been like programmed or influenced in some way by the dominant culture. And at the heart of every dominant culture lie the seeds of resistance, which will be its destruction. You know, like everything is there. And I have not spent time in, yes, totally. I want to hear about that too, Orion. I've never spent time in a place like China or North Korea or Russia, places that have these very like much more fascist leaning governments and suppressive behavior on the part of the government. I've only lived in the United States and Europe. So that's what I know. And if things like Pussy Riot are any indication, and if, what is that amazing artist's name from China? The man, yes, Ai Weiwei. If that's any indication, like there are always going to be outliers and exceptions. And I think in a space where people are allowed to know themselves at all, they will naturally gravitate to the things that they actually desire, the things that actually like resonate with who they are fundamentally. And it's also interesting. I thought of a really dear friend of mine was raised evangelical Christian. And the primary sin, according to her, in evangelical Christianity is to trust yourself. That you're never to trust yourself. You're never to, because that's the voice of the devil. You have to only listen to the Bible and listen to the leaders of your church, or else you will fall into an irreparable pattern of sin that will take you straight to hell. And that's the threat, is really about knowing and trusting yourself. And what a pernicious and insidious mechanism of control that is, like how subtle that really is. I think that's the ban on masturbation. That's the ban on lots of things that are self-referential and self-fulfilling, like pleasurable without anyone else being involved. So yes, there's always going to be an influence from the tribe, you know, if I can use that word without it being referring to anything in particular, without it. There will always be dominant influence from the culture, but I don't know necessarily that is where that ends. You know, it's not just people falling in line.
I also would add to that, it's a very Western dominant culture construct to think that there's some pure, perfect past to get back to. That, you know, if we can just strip this thing away, then you can actually get to the real thing, which is your real desires or your real true consent. And that's, if you take away the sex language, that sounds a lot like heaven, which sounds a lot like Christianity, which sounds like the dominant culture. So, so I'm aware of that. Though I think part of the language around this is you can't undo everything, and nor would you want to, because then you're left not being able to organize anything. But just to see what are the parts of the forest that never got a chance to get any sun because of one big tree that got put there, not by you, but what it looks like when there starts to be some different biodiversity, when other nutrients get a chance to show in the underground. I'm just going to push that analogy because I just fell upon it really hard. And then see what happens, because it might be that, you know, the dominant culture's wishes for you don't go away, but you're like, oh, but they can live in a relationship once these other things had a chance.
Do you think it's possible even to change your desires, or is this just a call to examine them? Really?
Both. I think you can absolutely change your desires, because when you were 4, you loved playing with, you know, dolls or trucks or whatever you like playing with, and you don't desire that anymore.
I understand, but sexuality feels different.
Totally. But I think about who I was when I was 16, or 18. Like my desires have changed.
Yes,
Yeah,
but
I think there's a
Um,
difference between saying my desires have changed and I have changed my desires. Like my desires grow and evolve, but can I decide
Fair.
suddenly, oh, to continue like in the context of this conversation, oh, I've just come to some epiphany that, you know, my desires are inherently ableist. Am I now gonna like choose that, you know, now I'm only going to be attracted to disabled folks, which carries a whole sort of fetishization and, you know, that all that stuff with it. So I think there's a difference between saying over time, my desire, like who I desire now is not who I desired then. Some of that has to do with no, I don't want to say evolution because it's not like my past self was unevolved, but some of that has to do with a widening of my perspective. But it's not that I have set out to change my desires to make them fall in line with some political, you know, paradigm. And I don't, and I personally don't think that there's necessarily a way that you can change your desires that won't feel in some way like you're using other people for your own sense of like, now, you know, I'm evolved, et cetera, et cetera. I think in my mind, I think it's important to be conscious and to examine, and you can go through a whole state of examining your desires and then decide, you know, actually, I'm fine with my desires. But when I think about this question of design of examining, I think about like cishet dudes who actually desire fat women, but you know don't want to talk about it and don't want anyone to know, and then end up behaving really badly towards the fat women that they're attracted to, whether or not they're in a sexual or romantic relationship with those people. So I think there's a way of examining the ways in which you deny yourself what your actual desire is because you're told that to have that desire is wrong. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think there's a real difference between in motivation, you know?
Yeah.
Like the difference between I'm broadening and like expanding upon my desires and accepting them, like exploring, which has elements to it of like neuroplasticity and what imprints I'm making for myself and like what do I feel curious about, and you know, it's like it's the shuffle function on the porn site. It's like, oh, what's everybody doing? I don't know. And as opposed to something like conversion therapy, which is totally, you know, you can't be shamed out of wanting something. I just don't think that works.
Right.
I don't think it's possible for me to change my sexual desires. I do think it's possible for me to, as Tom is saying in the chat, open my mind and be conscious of my biases and the water that I'm swimming in that influences my sexual desires. But I don't believe that it's possible to desire people that I previously did not desire.
I think that,
and also, yeah,
I think the questioning of it though, so I'm a lesbian, queer dyke, and I primarily am only attracted to butch women, to butch and masculine ascender folks. And every now and then over the last 30 years, I'm in my 50s now, over the last 30 years, I say to myself, okay, M'kali-Hashiki, what's up with this, like not being attracted to femmes? Is there some piece of it that's, you know, internalized sexism? Like, what's that about? Or are you just not attracted to femmes? And I have different answers around that at different times. And but because I think I probably ask myself this, I probably have this conversation maybe every 5 years for the past 30 years. And you know, a little while ago, I like found myself in this situation where I actively, you know, tried to pick up this femme woman who shot me down, and I was horribly, I mean, she did it very respectfully, but I was heartbroken. And so it's not that I feel like I've suddenly like, oh, M'kali-Hashiki, you were being sexist, therefore you must start being attracted to femmes and feminine women. It's more like, as I kept asking myself about it, I was able to understand some of the pieces that were about sort of lumping all feminine behavior together and sort of seeing like, oh, if I'm attracted to a femme, that's like me having sex with myself. I'm fabulous, but I don't really want to have sex with myself. And then also being able to pick out the pieces there was some internalized sexism, particularly around fucking and being fucked and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that over time, it's not, I wouldn't say that it's true that like now I'm suddenly only lusting after femmes, but the restriction that I had before around like, somebody a friend would be like, oh, let me fix you up with so-and-so. And I'd be like, oh, no. And then they say they're femme. And I'd be like, ah. So that sort of has, it's broadened a little bit, but I don't think it would have broadened if I hadn't been asking myself that question over and over again. And I don't think that the end result is that now I'm no longer attracted to masculine-centered people and only attracted to feminine-centered people. That's not the end result. But my pool of who I look at and who I desire has actually broadened.
Yeah, definitely not talking about a switching, but a broad expansion. Let's explore another flaw that both Eric and Matthew brought up to me when I was planning this show. The current consent models that we spoke about in the first show, these may stymie experimentation. So if people take the enthusiastic requirement too literally and don't try anything they're unsure of, then exploration and excitement, which arguably make our sexual lives better and more pleasurable and more interesting and more exciting, gets diminished or gets demolished if we only are able to consent to the things that we absolutely know that we want. What about the things that we don't know that exist or don't know that we might want? It takes away, and Matt said, it dictates your future by your past experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So Matt suggested that a way forward might be to cultivate a deep, radical trust. How might that go?
I think it comes back to what you brought up in the last show, Lila, which I think was something that Marsha B, that she said, which is that if you can't say no, your yes is meaningless. I mean, that's the foundation of radical trust, right? That at any moment you're in such a deep and trustworthy connection with another human being that if something shifts for you in the experience, if you're suddenly not into it, or if something doesn't work for you in whatever way, they will either pick up on it by themselves, or you will let them know, and they will instantaneously be present in care of you in that. Like that's kind of where that starts, is like knowing that that's going to be how it goes, that they're actually listening and attentive and give a shit. In the presence of that, I think you could try all sorts of things in the spirit of, let's try it. I don't know how it's going to go, but I'm not going to feel like I'm being dominated or taken advantage of if I don't want to be.
Is that a flaw of the Fry's model of needing enthusiastic consent? What if you're like, I think I want to try it, but it's not like, fuck yeah. Is that not consent then?
I don't think it's that black and white, honestly. I don't know that it's, honestly, I don't know that any aspect of consent is ever that black and white.
Yes.
That it's stark yes or stark no.
Well, I think about the in the SM community, the lists, the ubiquitous lists, where you have met someone, you're thinking about doing a scene, and then you're like, here's my list, here's your list, and there's a gajillion different versions of the list out there, but one of the lists is something like, you pick you pick the item or the items, the actions, and then there's like a hell yes, hell no. You can tell it's been a while since I've had any kinky sex. Hell yes, hell no. Maybe I'll do it if it really gets you off. I'm not against it, but maybe, and then somewhere in there is hell no. And I definitely feel like I've had experiences where you do the list exchange with someone, and then there's you see where if the things that are hell yes for me are not hell no's for them, or vice versa. Like maybe my hell yes is if it works for you, I don't really care. I'll agree to do it. I still count that as consent. And as depending on what other things are involved, what other kind of dynamics are involved, we could still do that. We are both consenting to do a thing that we have agreed that is a hell yes for me, and it's like scratching my knee for the other person, but they still are like into doing it. And I've been on either side of that. And so when I've been on the side of like, honey, if it does it for you, I'm all for it. I don't feel like I'm being taken advantage of, or that I couldn't say no, because I had the option to put it on my hard no list, but I didn't. I was like, no big whoop for me, but I'm not turned off by it. I'm not triggered by it. So if you want to do it, let's do it. And that could be a thing that I have done before and had that experience. Or it could be a thing like, I'm not sure. It doesn't sound like a thing that's going to be a hell yes for me, because I've never done it before. But why not? Sure, let's do it. It's a hell yes for you. I'm interested in grooving with you. Let's do the thing. And I still feel like that's consent.
I agree with you. And it's so there's lots of things to say about S&M or BDSM scenes, but when you come with a menu, then you have that option, where of course the gray part of consent is when you don't know what the menu is. And I've had experiences in my own life in sexual and non-sexual spaces where, but I'll just use a non-sexual for an example, where someone says, let's go on an adventure. What adventure is it? I don't know. I would say no to anyone else, but I'll say yes with you because I trust your sense of adventure and your sense of safety. So I'm going with you. And so to translate that into a sexual space, I don't know exactly what's on the menu. It doesn't, and of course, if I trust that person, I'll be like, whoa, that thing is definitely not my speed. Or you might think, that's definitely not my speed, but I trust this person. I think that still can be consent. But if you slow that down so much to say, well, I didn't know about this ahead of time, you lose the opportunity to say, oh my God, this experience could have been amazing. And I mean, em-KAH-lee, you don't know this particular story, and I think I told this to you, Lila, but just to use it as an example, because I was very touched by it. When I was doing my urban tantra training, and Betty Martin and Barbara Carrells were watching me do body work at one point, and it was sort of a stripped down, fast version of it. So it was like a half-hour session as opposed to a full session. They both looked at me when I was done. They were like, nobody could have ever consented to this, but the way that you held the space was so, no one could have asked you the things that you did because of like your particular dynamic with body work. Because no one would say, oh yes, put your arms across my knee underneath and like sort of like make a joint lock. No one would think to put that into body work. Not to say no one ever has, but if you're on the receiving end, you wouldn't think, yeah, that's what I want. But both of them sort of blessed me and said, yeah, the way that you approach body work is sort of, obviously within the consent structure, because people are saying they want body work. but you are creating a space that says, I trust you to take me to places that I don't know, and I trust you enough to say to stop when I am at a limit.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been very lucky that women who come, and men, come to work with me or allow themselves to be surprised
So this
in the consent structure.
brings up two things, which is that the Fry's model and the Antioch College model of like needing to check in at each incremental step of any sexual encounter. I mean, this is what Matt and I were talking about, I think, on the phone before we got on with you last week, Lila, which is that in the absence of a trusting connection, like a known, trusting, deep, true connection between two people that feels mutual and feels safe, like genuinely safe at a nervous system level, that you can relax around this person physically, then you have to do a step-by-step. And it's like, it's the one tries to replace the other, that you can like proceed without that trust if you're checking in and making sure. I mean, this is that fucking app that came out at some point during Me Too that some tech bro invented to basically like get legal consent to protect a guy, presumably, in the event that he was going to like hook up with somebody. You could get like, it was an app that was created where you could like get the woman or whoever you were going to hook up with to say like, yes, I consented this, so that in the event that it came back at you, you had like a thing to show their lawyer or whatever. It makes very little sense to me. It's really gross, but I mean, that's like such an extreme, but it's so indicative of like, what are we even talking about when we talk about consent? Are we talking about a legal term? Are we talking about something that you can get kicked out of college for not observing? Like, who's to say? Like, what is the determination in the absence of two people who are actually just communicating well with each other? And we have a whole lot of people in the world who aren't communicating well with each other and sex, arguably. In the absence of that, and in the presence of like hookup culture, which is, it is what it is. It's pretty prevalent. That it becomes necessary to have these like step-by-step, really broken down, like pablum things that we can talk about. Matt, you're muted.
Labor-saving devices.
Yeah.
Pamela, can we spend a few minutes on age-appropriate consent education and how we might think about teaching young people?
Yeah. So it's my opinion. It's my experience, I should say, as somebody who's been an educator for a really long time and who, not just about sex, but as a teacher. I started teaching right out of college. And who's now a mom to a daughter who's almost 5. Yeah, consent is taught immediately. And it's obviously not sexual when you first are discussing consent, but it really has to do with like, who has the power here and what are we going to do about that? And it's something that Betty Martin says, that this is also something that Matt and I talked about before the show last week, that we really both understood differently. And Matt, I think I want you to talk about how you heard it, because I think I heard a more evolved version of it. What I heard Betty Martin say is that as children, as people, as human beings, we get used to being touched in ways that we don't want, because as children, we're always touched in ways that we don't want. We don't consent to being yanked out of the street. We don't consent to, being carried in from the car when we're asleep. Like, we don't consent to those things. And those two examples that I just gave aren't dangerous. They're not overpowering. They're not dominating. Like, the adult in those instances isn't being an asshole, but those aren't things that you consent to when you're little. And so we get used to, at the other end of the spectrum, you have sexual abuse and all sorts of other really grotesque abuses of power between adults and children, which you see really all the time. Like, there's plenty of institutionalized, completely legal and socially acceptable versions of dominance of children by adults. But in any case, like, regardless of where you fall on that spectrum in your own experience as a human, you get used to being touched in a way that you don't want or that you don't consent to. And so for me, as a parent and as an educator and as someone who's just in contact with and in relationship with lots of children, it's super important to acknowledge that the adult in an adult-child relationship does in fact have all the power, or the majority of it, and then to not be a dick about it. You know, to like not pull rank when you don't need to pull rank, to give the kids in your company, the kids in your sphere, as much agency as you possibly can within the realm of safety and everyone remaining in good connection. So that's the beginning of it. And it's examples of things like, no, you don't. I mean, this is the popular one. Like, no, you don't have to kiss him. You don't have to let your uncle kiss you. You don't have to sit on anyone's lap. You don't have to give hugs if you don't feel like it. You don't have to. I mean, this comes up with my daughter a lot because for some good portion of this quarantine, she refused to wear clothes at all. She went like full feral. And I was like, all right, well, we're inside and we're in our garden. That's cool. But no, you can't go naked to the park. Like, that's not going to work for me. Why? Because I don't want you to go naked because you might get bitten by bugs. And because if we come into contact with other people, I don't want other people to get to like see your whole naked body. That's not the culture that we live in right now. And at some point at the park, she said, I wished we just lived in a place where everyone was naked all the time. I was like, I don't disagree with you. That's not where we are. There are such places, but we're not in one right now. So it's like to have some sense of, I mean, to use your word, it's to have some sense of horizontality, some like lateral aspect to the power structure so that it's not completely top down. And I find that quite rare in the world that we live in. I think it exists much more in First Nations cultures, or did. That there are, I mean, this is part of what Kim Tallbear was talking about too when I listened to her recently. Matt brought her into my attention. She was talking about the power structures of like how people raise kids in other cultures, and that it's not the nuclear family adults in charge model, that it's a much more communal lateral model where kids are being raised by many different people and have access to many different examples of how to be a human. You know, it's not just.
Since we're talking,
go ahead.
Sorry,
please.
Since we're talking a lot about sexual consent and touch, physicality, how do you start that? Like, nobody gets to touch your body unless you want them to, but then also, you know, mom and dad are going to pick you up and feed you and whatever, you know?
Yeah. I need to chew that for a moment. Do either of you have a good one to come back with?
She's muted.
I'll bring up another thing on my short list because I didn't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I did.
M'kali's muted.
M'kali-Hashiki's muted. Hold on.
Can you unmute her?
I got it.
She had things to say.
Damn it. What's happening? Oh, there you are.
Okay, there we go.
Yes. Whoa, what just happened? What's that?
Oh, no, you're back.
Okay. I'm back. I was thinking about this, you know, as someone who works with people to have them regain their sense of autonomy, often because that autonomy has been, you know, taken away from them as children. And I just remember I was in Oaxaca, and I was meeting up with some friends, and so, you know, there were two adults, and then I think the daughter might be 12 or 13. And oftentimes I don't see her when I see her mother. And, you know, I'm in the Bay, we're all touchy-feely, whatever. And so when I bumped into them, I like hugged everybody, and then I hugged the daughter, and then I was like, whoa, this kid doesn't know me, like has seen me maybe twice. I didn't give her any opportunity to like not hug me. And so then later on in the evening, we went out to dinner, and she happened to be sitting across from me. And I said, hey, I just wanted to check in with you. You know, earlier when we bumped into each other in the street, I hugged you, and I didn't really give you the option of whether or not you wanted to hug me. And I just want to let you know, you're not obligated. Like, I don't know what conversation you've had with your mother, but I want to let you know that you're not obligated to hug me. And I will try to be more mindful about that when I see you in the future. And she was kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. But, you know, I know that at some other point that will have sunk in. I don't know about the other adults that she's coming across. And if anyone has said that to her. But I was really like, I was sort of like, oh my God, em-KAH-lee-HAH-she-kee, what did you just do? Like, you just grabbed up this child who you see maybe like once every, I don't know, 3 months or something, without pausing at all. And I agonized over it like the whole day until dinner. It's like, I've got to talk to this child. I've got to apologize. I've got to let her know that she doesn't have to hug me, you know, regardless of what conversation she may or may not have had with her mother. And then I also think about children, having been a child, children who, I mean, not having, we've all been child, but children who have had, you know, serious illnesses or have had, you know, hospitalizations as children. And I remember writing this blog piece about how so much of my particular, I'm a burn survivor, so much of my healing part as a child involved, you know, violations of my bodily autonomy over and over and over again as part of healing from my injury. So then how does, you know, how much of that then was unconsciously affecting my ability to give consent or not give consent by the time I became a sexual being, and in my early experiences or experiments or what have you. Not that I have an answer, but as many things, I have a lot of questions, don't have a lot of answers.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. I want to presence that in an hour-long show, we have about 5 to 10 more minutes. And I have many wonderings. So I don't want to impose upon anybody's time. If you're willing to go over by 15 minutes, we can do so. If not, we can end the broadcast and we'll just not do those things. Okay. So at that mark, I can stay on with Matt and Pamela. And so let's get into some wonderings I have about consent and power. How can we know with greater subtlety when we have power over our lover that needs to be addressed? Is consent possible between people who have a power imbalance? Some people seem to believe no. I have a little list of possible power imbalances with one example each. I'll just run through that really quickly. Physical, one partner could physically overpower the other easily, for example. Emotional, one partner is in love with the other, but it isn't mutual, for example. Monetary, one partner wealthy and partially or fully supporting the other. Employment, a boss-subordinate relationship, for example. Domestic, a landlord-tenant relationship. Status, one partner being a celebrity, for example. Race, one partner being a person of color or both being people of color with different levels of privilege in society, for example. Looks, for example, one partner is particularly gorgeous, pretty person privilege. Intelligence, for example, one partner is exceptionally street smart. Or emotional intelligence, for example, one partner has a strong grasp of psychology and interpersonal relationships and the other doesn't. Education, for example, one partner having a PhD. So is it possible to have consent in a situation in which one person has a measure of power over the other? M'kali-Hashiki and I talked about this in our conversation yesterday, and we were talking about the boss relationship particularly, because there are a lot of people who say that if someone has the power to get you fired, if someone has the power to take away your income, then consent is not possible. And I think this is an unpopular opinion, but I don't believe that. I believe consent is possible.
Same one.
But how might it be, and how might we mitigate it? Well, I think I liken it to risk-aware consensual kink, right? So if I'm aware that I'm hot for boss and I'm gonna fuck my boss, I know that there is a possibility that I could lose my job, that things could shift in my income. That doesn't mean I can't say yes. I'm engaging with awareness of the possibility that this could blow up in my face. It's still possible for me to consent.
What about if the roles are flipped?
Yeah, we talked about that as well. M'kali-Hashiki, do you want to say what you said on the phone?
He's muted.
No, I figured it out. I think I figured it out. I think it's really, as I was saying during our conversation, I feel like there's an unwillingness for folks, and there's, first of all, let's just say, very few of us, if we think of privilege like as a spectrum, very few by only marginalized spaces or only privileged spaces, right? Like there's a lot of that. And so I feel like in a lot of communities, there is an unwillingness for people to examine and acknowledge the places of the arenas of privilege that they exist in. And so I think without that willingness for someone with privilege or power, like out and out power, the power to fire you, that's not just privilege, right? Without the person, if it's an unequal power dynamic, the person with more power or the person with more privilege, without an awareness on their part and an articulated understanding of that privilege and power to the other person, along with some sort of true, not just saying it, some sort of true reassurance, I'm making a move for you, and if you reject me, it's not going to affect your employment, it's not going to affect your lease, et cetera, et cetera. Without all of those things, then I don't think it's true consent. And also, I think that it needs to, the initial impetus needs to come from the person who has the less power or privilege. I mean, even if you're let's hook up and I want you to know this is not going to affect your job. Do I believe that? I don't know if I believe that. If I come onto my boss and like, hey, I'm hot for you, let's do it. And the boss is, and then I might ask for a reassurance. They should, somehow that reassurance needs to be in there. Otherwise, I don't believe that, I don't know that either party can trust that the other person is actually consenting.
Yeah, thank you for giving some language to that, because that's one of the big questions I have is how can we mitigate the possibilities that our partner is afraid to say no to us? How do we make it possible for them to speak truth to power in these scenarios? And can we preemptively care for the potential worries that they might have about saying no by using some of the language that you use? If you're not available for that, I'll work with you. I'll still recommend you to that thing I said I would, which is the story that I told in the first one. Then I still do that over the phone. I'll still be kind to you. I'll still pay for your meal. I'll still employ you. I'll still let you stay in this house. I want you to know that this, regardless of what your answer is, this will not affect your home, your job, your.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think when there's an unwillingness for the boss to acknowledge, if we start this thing and we break up, I'm aware that you might just fire me because you don't want to be around me, right? You're my boss. If the boss is like, no, that would never happen. That would never happen. Why would you be afraid of that? Then that person, is not, I don't think they're trustworthy. Like I would need them to be like, okay, yeah, I could see how that's a concern of yours. And the other thing is, maybe I'm jaded, but I think in a lot of situations, the person doesn't say that because they don't mean it, right? They're totally like, I'm your boss. I want to hook up with you. If this goes wrong, I'm totally going to fire you. Like that's that's in the back of their head. Like, oh, if it doesn't work out, that's fine because I can always fire them, right? Like that's just what I think. Maybe I'm a jaded person, but I think that doesn't come up because it is in the back of that person's mind, the person with power. Oh, I can fuck my tenant because if it goes astray, I can kick him out.
Not in Oakland.
How can we be more aware of some less obvious power that we have over our lovers? You know, it's very obvious if the person is, if I'm the boss. It's very obvious if I'm the landlord.
I think
maybe it's less obvious if it's education or.
I think also just the example of like one person is in love with the other and the other doesn't return those feelings. That's a significant power dynamic.
Oh, it's huge. I've been in that one so often on that side of it, being the one who is emotionally invested and the other person not.
Yeah, I've been on both sides of it and it fucking sucks both times, both ways. That's a tough one to navigate.
Yeah, I was on that.
To navigate around, yeah. And it kind of comes back to the question of like, how do you know you really want what you want? If the thing that you want is destructive to you, but you still want it.
Right. And I did some work around examining the benefits of the destructiveness of desiring unavailable men.
What are the benefits?
They will never encroach upon my freedom. They will never, ask for more time than I am willing to give. I don't have to commit. I get to reinforce a childhood story that I am not worthy of being chosen. So they're like shadow benefits, but they're benefits nonetheless to my psyche. So I've been exploring that and working with that. And
that's existential kink. That's great.
And actively giving up all the unavailable men that I've ever loved. I've taken deliberate action in the world to do that. I spent a day removing all of them from my Facebook. I wrote a few of them direct emails. Most of them I just removed and didn't tell them. So let's move on to a potential call for the future. What could it look like in the future in an agency culture? And em-KAH-lee-HAH-she-kee, you spoke to me about your work around QPOC sex magic rituals, a reclamation of desire, and you expressed that sometimes it can be harder to find the yes and say the yes if you're feeling ashamed than it is to find your no.
So as a whole piece around the little voice that talks to us, right? And sometimes that little voice is the voice of our ancestors. And I'm speaking particularly about people who are racialized as others, so people of color. Sometimes that little voice really is the voice of our ancestors in an effort to protect us from the kind of torment and punishment that when they tried to have bodily autonomy, and bodily autonomy also includes, the autonomy to have the kind of sex that they want. So sometimes that voice, is our ancestors' voice, and that we do a disservice if we try to simply, I got to shut that voice up. That's simply about making me feel shameful, and I need to ignore it, and blah blah blah, and we get to this whole story. And I think it's important and I'm speaking specifically of people of color, to acknowledge where that voice came from, why that is actually an act of protection, and then to acknowledge that we are living in a somewhat different time, depending, but that we're living in a different time. And so figuring out, like, what does it mean to have bodily autonomy? What are the other, it's not as simple as just being like, I'm going to say yes to this thing. Like, what are the other things going on in my life that affect my ability to say yes to this thing I want? And what if the thing that I want, and again, I'm speaking particularly for people of color, what if the sexual desire I have is one that fits into whatever the racist stereotype around my type, around my culture is? Then I'm committing a betrayal of my people if I say yes to this thing that I want. And so I think that there is a great value in coming together with people who have similar histories in this particular country, on this path that we're on, that there's some benefit to coming together with people who have similar, although different, sort of histories, and figuring out how to reclaim our autonomy, not just as an act of, this is the sex life I want to have right now, but also as an act of healing ancestral trauma, like actually healing the trauma of our ancestors. And so how consent fits into that is really about, I think, most of my work is about helping people shut up whatever the voice is that's in their head, but sort of getting back to what if I can silence this voice, all of these different voices, the voice of my ancestors, the voice of the dominant society that tells me every day how little how little value I am in this society as a person. If I can shut that voice up, if I can shut up the voice of my ancestors, if I can shut the then maybe I can listen to I can actually listen to what my body is telling me. And then I get to examine what does consent look like, and what is the support, what are the resources I need from my community in order to feel like I actually have autonomy and that I actually am consenting to things I actually want. And that's like, that's an ongoing thing. It's definitely not a one and done.
So let's wrap this out with a vision for what a future could look like when there is great sexual empowerment and agency. What does agency culture look like, Pamela, Matthew, and M'kali-Hashiki?
Well, I think first it's one where the dominant culture is one that nourishes people's presence in and love of their own bodies, whatever they are. I think that's where it's got to start. It's very difficult, as M'kali-Hashiki was just saying, it's very difficult to feel yourself as sexually empowered when you're at war with your own body for any reason, or when you feel diminished culturally, socially, personally, by the body that you are, the body that you have. So I personally see it starting with really healing the rupture that we're all dealing with between rational, linear, materialist, like head first, as separate from the body, and the diminishing of the body's desires as being problematic or taking up too much time or taking up too much space. That there's no room for, there's no room to just be. You have to be doing.
As Ryan mentioned earlier in the chat about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm envisioning the current consent culture to take care of that bottom layer of the pyramid of the hierarchy. It deals with safety, basically safety primarily. And I envision an agency culture that would move us up this pyramid towards self-actualization, where there is a great unveiling and experimentation following curiosity and excitement.
You're still muted. You're still muted. Wait.
Mute her.
Still muted.
Let me do it. I'm trying. I'm trying. I have tried several times.
Am I still muted?
Nope, you're back.
Okay. So the thing that I've said for a while is that what the world that I envision, part of it is a world or society in which everyone has equal access to the resources they need to develop their physical, mental, emotional, spiritual potential, however far it goes. And in physical, I include, pleasure and physical pleasure, and including sexual pleasure. And so, and those resources can mean, that means education. That means, in order to develop yourself to your full physical potential, you have to have healthcare. You have to be able to, eat. You have to be able to have the money to buy food that will develop your physical. So I feel like that includes all of those things. But I really think that the ability to have resources, to have access to education about what our bodies are capable of, and the support to say, explore your limits, your mental limits, your emotional limits, your mental limits. Go as far towards the line as you can. And we as a society, that's something we want, to be able to explore those limits. And I think without that, a priority, without that being a societal priority, get to a place where everyone has authentic autonomy and agency over their bodies and over what is done to their bodies, not just what their bodies can do. Because I feel like I've been getting into a lot of conversations with folks around the whole wear mask, not wear mask, but the bodily autonomy is not just what you can do with your body, to allow or forbid to happen to your body.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to say something before I invite you to tell people how to find you all?
Yes, I would say this. The four of us who are on the face of this consent show, and anyone else who's listening at this moment or in the future who might be listening to such a thing, will never see this. These are all our wonderings for them, and capacity for us to try to plant seeds for trees under whose shade we will never sit, under whose fruits we will never eat, is part of our grief-filled longing for a better day. And so we can say absolutely like, oh yes, it should include this, and it should include that, and may it be so. And the way it's going to look, if it gets there, which is all a big if, requires a deep memory of history of how we found ourselves here in this particular crater, and not making it look any better or worse than it is, to be very faithful to the time. So I would pray that elders are remembered. I pray that self-actualization isn't at the top, that village-mindedness might be, and that people wouldn't be responsible for doing all the work of a village to do all these things. I pray that ancestors are remembered and that land is remembered, and all those things factor into ways of the hierarchy of needs are not even a hierarchy. But it would just be so. I'd pray for all those things. And I can't even, this goes back to being surprised by consent. Like, these are all things that I can imagine, so I'm defining them by that which I know. I would pray to be surprised by the way these things might manifest. And I'd pray for that for my great-grandchildren, who I don't know that I'll ever have, because I don't have any birth children of my own. Well, that's a complicated story. I'd pray for that. That the mystery would unfold in such a way to make it finer and more beautifully heartbroken than I could ever imagine.
And with that, would you all tell people where to find you? I'll drop some links in the chat.
I'm still unmuted. So you could, I muse about things like this on my skincare business, primalderma.com. Or yeah, sure. Yeah.
You can find me at Fierce Passions. Am I muted? Am I muted? I'm not muted. Nope. Am I? Okay. You can find me at fiercepassions with an s.com. M'kali-Hashiki means fierce passion, so just add an S, and that's where you can find me on the internet.
You can find me at em-Bodywork.la, em-Bodywork.la, em-Bodywork.la.
I dropped the links in the chat. Thank you so much, M'kali-Hashiki, Pamela, Matthew, for spending this time wondering aloud with me and rumbling on the topic of consent. I'm grateful for your brains and the bodies they are housed in, and all that it took for them to survive so that we could have this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lila.